Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our members and guests and their guests. The Harvard Club of Boston is a place of fellowship and connection. I hope that during the course of this evening, you take the opportunity to connect with someone you know and also connect with somebody new. Before we begin, I want to thank Becky Blazer and her Harvard class of '98 and her team for organizing this wonderful event, which is part of our leadership series. Becky and her team lead all things relating to membership, marketing, and member engagement at the club. Thank you to Steve Cummings, our general manager, and the entire Harvard Club of Boston team for all they do to provide wonderful and exceptional member services. There are 4 components to great member experiences: concept, planning, execution, and participation. Many thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Give yourselves a round of applause for being here. Now to the important stuff. From the hard courts in Cambridge to the Massachusetts State House, and now to the most powerful and influential person in college athletics, Charlie Baker has never taken an easy path. Governor Baker is a graduate of the Harvard College class of '79. The governor served 2 terms as the 72nd Chief Executive of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In March of this year, Governor Baker began serving as the president of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. Tonight, we are excited to hear about his journey from a small town in New York, yay, New York, I'm from New York, I can't help it, okay, in New York, to the leader of the NCAA, an organization dedicated to the well-being and lifelong success of more than 500,000 student athletes. Thank you, Governor Baker, for joining us tonight. Now, tonight, Governor Baker will be in conversation with Andy Freed. Andy Freed is a Harvard College graduate of class of 1990, Kennedy School in '94. So this government stuff, he actually went to class and knows something. So hopefully we'll see what happens. Besides being and here's a little fun fact about Andy. Besides being captain of the Harvard men's water polo team, Andy has the distinction of being the youngest Division I men's water polo coach in the country back in the day. Andy is a member of our Board of Governors and serves as co-chair of our Member Experience Committee. And just in case you want to know, Andy does have a day job. Andy's day job is CEO of Virtual Inc., an award-winning strategic consulting, public relations, and marketing and operations management company. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Andy Freed.
Before I bring the governor up here, we're talking about 2 people first. Tip O'Neill is the first one. So Tip O'Neill, and Frank Phillips is here, and he can verify this. You know, Tip O'Neill used to always say you've got to ask for every vote. So if you are here and you are not a member, I'm asking for your vote right now. Become a member. You know, don't leave here without talking to some of our team and becoming a member. You know, I am the chair of the Membership Engagement Committee. This is what we do. Now, the second person I'll quote, much more important person than Tip O'Neill, and that is, of course, the boss, Bruce Springsteen. Now, as my wife is in the second row and would attest, I am this close to throwing it all away and just following Bruce Springsteen around the world. And in every show, you know, right now it is before 10th Avenue freeze out, and by the way, I've seen 12 shows this tour, you know, so far. You know, Bruce always says, I want you to go home tonight, I want you to get out in your pajamas, and I want you to wake up your neighbors and tell them that you just saw the heart-stomping, earthquaking, booty-shaking, love-making, history-making E Street Band. For those of you that are members tonight, here's your assignment. I want you to go home. I want you to tell your classmates. I want you to tell your friends. I want you to tell everyone in your community that you came to the Harvard Club of Boston tonight and saw a pretty darn good program, because that's what we're going to have tonight. And let's get more folks here. Can you guys do that tonight? Yeah. All right. So enough about the boss, enough from me. Let's bring up the governor. So Governor Charlie Baker. Yeah, who knew? Woo. And so, all right, Charlie, so it's great to have you here, Governor. We'll start out with an easy one. Do you miss the governor's job at all?
Yes.
What do you miss?
Everything. That was the only job I ever wanted, right? I mean, when people are kids, when I was 10 years old, I wanted to be a wide receiver for the San Diego Chargers. That didn't work out. But the job I always wanted from the time I was kind of a teenager was to be governor of Massachusetts.
So were you that kid? So everyone knew somebody, and every undergrad from Harvard can attest to this. Everyone knew somebody in college at Harvard who seemed to already be running for governor. Were you that guy?
No.
Okay.
I was not that guy. I was a Republican in Massachusetts. So.
Solid point.
But I did run into this Harvard guy named Bill Weld, who was also a Republican in Massachusetts.
We had him a few months ago here.
And I worked on his campaign, and he won.
Yeah, so is that what kind of made you, what kind of really solidified the fever for you and made you say, like, this isn't just, so at some point you said, I can't be a wide receiver for the Chargers.
Yeah, I gave that one up pretty early, actually.
Yeah, so, but at what point, at some point you said, but I could actually be governor of Massachusetts. So what was that point?
It's not so much that you could be, it's that you would want to be. I mean, I've always felt in politics and in public life generally, the big question is, do you want to do the job? Plenty of people want to have it, right? But do you want to do it? And after spending 8 years working for Governor Weld and then Governor Cellucci, it was a job that I really wanted. And I knew when my wife and I, at that point in time, Lauren, had 3 little kids, so it wasn't going to be then. And, it still took me 2 tries to get there. And the second, after I lost to Governor Patrick, another Harvard grad, in 2010.
We had him too. It's pretty fun. We've done pretty well. We're cleaning up on governors.
So I'm kind of like the last one. Huh?
No. We have some bad news for Governor Swift.
Jeez. So, even with the race in 14, we beat Martha Coakley, but Karen Polito and I by this much. So, but having watched Weld and Cellucci and having had a chance to sort of get a sense for how that all worked, I felt pretty confident that we would be able to do well. And, in a job like that, I guess the way you measure if you're doing well is whether or not you feel like you're making any progress on anything that matters. But the reason, you said, Andy, do I miss the job? The answer is yes. I mean, I miss the people, I miss the work, I miss the sense of satisfaction you get when, some mayor or city manager or principal says, that thing you guys did really made a difference in our community. It's the one job in politics that I would argue is big enough to really hold your interest because it's hugely complicated, but it's small enough that you can actually see the results of the work that you do.
So if you had made it to the Chargers, I have no doubt we'd have a great ESPN top 10 plays that we could have played tonight of your top 10 catches. If I had the highlight reel and you had to say, like, this is the thing I'm proudest of, what would be on your highlight reel from being governor?
It's funny. It would be the Commonwealth Fund's report on how the 50 states handled the COVID pandemic. Because we finished this far behind Hawaii, and Hawaii and Massachusetts finished way ahead of everybody else. Mm-hmm. And I say to people all the time, Hawaii's an island.
Yeah, it's kind of unfair.
And it's warm.
Yeah.
And we're the 3rd most densely populated state in America. So I think if they graded us on a curve, we would have been number 1.
In fairness, we kicked their butt on snow removal.
Totally, 100%.
We absolutely just cleaned their clock. And I'll say what.
And that was really, that was one of those, that 1.5, 2-year period was probably the most, right in your face example of why governors and elected officials matter, because you had a lot of different approaches to this going on all over the country.
And had to have been just an exhausting time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. My wife thinks, don't tell her, but she thinks I have PTSD from it. Every once in a while, I just lose my about something, and she's like, see, I told you.
Yeah. Well, you've really done a nice job moving to a nice, relaxing job that we'll talk about after this.
Yeah.
You know, to kind of ease that, you've really nailed that one.
I did.
You know, so what's also exciting for me today, I love getting, I've gotten to interview some of the other governors, and tonight, what's exciting me is not just that I get to talk to somebody who has been your governor of the Commonwealth, but you know, I'm sharing the stage now with 100% of the Republicans I've ever voted for in my life. You know, which is
I do hear that a lot, actually.
Which I'm pretty thrilled about. And I guess a question I've got is, you know, what would you have done if you had 4 more years?
You know, honestly, some of the stuff that Governor Healy's doing is exactly the stuff I would have been doing. The housing thing has been, will continue to be our single biggest challenge. You know, we chased a whole bunch of housing initiatives, some of which we got, some of which we didn't. But, you know, the thing that really kind of made this housing thing like crystal clear for me was when Amazon was out looking for a second home on the East Coast, and we made it to the final 5 states, and they came to visit Massachusetts, and we had an exit interview with them when they left, and they said, you know, your housing prices and costs here are incredibly high, and the process by which you build new housing is really bad. And that could be your big problem, because you got lots of smart people, great institutions, you got all that stuff. And so imagine, they tell us that our housing prices are too high and our housing process for development is not good. Their first choice is New York City.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And their second choice, when New York throws them out, is the greater Washington metropolitan area. Yeah. And, you know, when you're losing to those 2 places on your housing prices and your ability to build, that's kind of a big statement. And I'm, you know, I'm thrilled that the Gov filed a $4 billion housing initiative with a whole series of reforms. I just, the biggest population we lost over the last several years was not, you know, the old folks like me moving to Florida, right? It was the 25 to 35-year-olds. That was the biggest group that we lost. And we're losing them because they can't afford to buy a home here. And that one in particular, you know, we have got to figure it out.
Yep. So, you know, Governor, you were always, I mean, for your whole career from ANF, you know, like the first time I heard your name when you were at Administration and Finance was, you know, call Charlie Baker, he's Mr. Fix-It. All right, so you can't spell Mr. Fix-It without the letter T, which brings me to my next question. And I don't really have a question, but I'll kind of
don't need one.
I'll phrase this the way that it would have been if you were at Harvard and this was on an exam. The MBTA, discuss.
Commuter rail is pretty damn good. We put a lot of money into that. The bus system is pretty damn good. We put a lot of money into that. And I could get into the details, but I would put you all to sleep. We didn't get it done on the rapid transit system. We just didn't. And
what's it take to get it done? Is it just money? What is it that's missing?
You know, we spent more money on the rapid transit system than any administration dating back decades, okay? But you're talking about what was the oldest system in the country that had been underinvested in for years. And I don't have, you know, I don't have an excuse for this one. I don't know why all that money we spent didn't make that big a difference in terms of how it performed. And then in fact, in some respects, it actually regressed. it's big and complicated, but so's the commuter rail, and the bus system's not exactly easy either. But I do think the pandemic, and the interesting way the pandemic caused us more trouble than I realized when we were in it. When we were in it, the first thing that occurred to me was nobody's riding the subway system. This is great. We can spend all kinds of money and time doing physical improvements to the track and the infrastructure and the stations and all. And we did that. We put hundreds of millions of dollars into that. But the thing that happened as we came out of the pandemic was just huge challenges around staffing. And those are still the MBTA's.
You're certainly not alone with that.
But the MBTA has huge. So when we took office, because the MBTA has a pension, its pension system doesn't work this way now, but it used to work. If you had 20 years in, you could basically retire with 80% of what you made your last year. And so when we took office, literally like 50 or 60% of the people who were working for the T at that point in time were retirement eligible. And that's kind of a scary thing when you think about it, because there's a ton of talent that's tied up in those people that have been around for 20 years who literally can just walk out the door, collect their full pension, and get a job in the private sector and do very well. And I think one of the things that happened over the course of the pandemic was a whole bunch of those people who fell into that category said, you know what?
Had enough.
I've had enough. And, you know, when we left office, right, and this was after trying like crazy to fill positions, we had 1,000 vacancies at the MBTA. And I bet today, Frank, I bet if some reporter were to ask the MBTA how many open positions they have, I bet it's probably 1,000. And that is like the greatest challenge. In my opinion, that's the greatest challenge they've got. If you can't fill those positions, you know, if you can't adequately staff your right-of-way people and your maintenance folks and your track people and your drivers and all, if you can't adequately staff that, you just never catch up. And I didn't realize that this brain drain and just arms and legs drain was going on until we started to come out of the pandemic.
By the way, when you mentioned the pandemic, I think back to the note that I sent around to my company saying, this could be as long as 2 weeks that we might be working from home. Did you have a sense when you started, also when you talked about like, well, maybe now's the time to do deferred maintenance on the T, did you have a sense of, we probably have the time to do it, or were you thinking, we probably got 6 weeks?
So you kind of opened the door a little bit here for me to point out that I wrote a book with my first chief of staff called Results, which has a whole chapter in it that I wrote about the pandemic, which everyone in here would find pretty interesting, I think. But the point I'm going to make here is I talk about the way we were thinking about this thing from the beginning, right, all the way through. And our view pretty early on was that this was going to be a really rough ride. And the reason I say that is, I don't know how many of you remember the Biogen outbreak. At that point in time, you had to send all the tests to Washington, to the CDC, and then they would do the test and send you the results back. People weren't actually, it's crazy, the people weren't actually doing local testing, right? That was something we all had to invent and create where we were. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like we sent 70 tests to Washington and like 56 of them came back positive. And that was when I realized, holy shit, this thing is unbelievably contagious. And then I just started, okay, I'm gonna tell you a secret. I called several people I know in the healthcare and infectious disease community here in Massachusetts, and I said, can I talk to you guys once a week on Zoom, just for as long as it takes? I don't want you to have to identify yourselves. You're not gonna be like some official advisory board. You're just 6 people I know whose opinions I respect, who are really smart, and And I don't want anybody to know who you are, and I don't want you to tell anybody who you are, because I want you to tell me exactly what you think. And my team talked to those people every single week for like 2 years. And they said, they were set up before the end of, right around the end of March was when they landed. And they said to us, they said, you know, buckle up, this is going to be a while. And I remember calling a guy I know who worked in the pharmacy industry, and I know exactly where I was. We were driving home, it was around 10:30 at night, and we were right by Suffolk Downs, okay? And I got this guy on the phone, and I said, I'm starting to figure out just how ugly this whole thing is going to be. And we can spin the plates here on a variety of regulatory policy issues and all the rest for a while, but if it takes like 2 years to get a vaccine, we are just screwed. And I'm calling you to find out, you know, can you give me some sense about how long you think this is going to take? And he said, well, he said Pfizer's working on something, I think they'll probably get there by around the end of the year. And there's this other company called Moderna, which I know you've never heard of, which is actually located in Massachusetts, and they'll probably have something in the market by the end of the year too. And that was the first time I hung up the phone and I thought, okay, so can we spin the plates
There's a finish line.
until the end of the year? And that was the first time I thought, okay, well, maybe we'll be out of this at some point. But that was, by the end of March, I was pretty sure this was going to be a rough ride.
All right, so my last question was an essay question. This next one, I wish I could draw. I can't draw at all. If I could draw, for this next question, I would have a picture of an elephant, and the elephant would say GOP on it. And next to the elephant would be Jim Jordan, and Representative Gates and some other folks. And then I would have said, Governor, let's talk about the elephant in the room. And it would have been awesome. But I can't draw, so we can't do any of that. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. You are somehow a Republican by some definition that does not include the definition of many other people in the Republican Party.
Yep.
And many people, which I would imagine and I've heard you speak out, that this isn't the Republican Party I signed up for. Can you speak about the state of the Republican Party, and is there a spot for, what happened to the Charlie Baker Republican and the moderate middle of the Republican Party, and can it ever come back?
I think the trends in politics generally for the Republicans and the Democrats are both heading to the edges.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is social media totally changed everything about influence. And social media is where all the people who are sort of single issue warriors found each other. And they went from being a small piece of the puzzle on both sides to being the most organized and the loudest and the most influential parts of both parties. And if you look at the registration data, sort of right around 1995, maybe a little bit into 2000, the number of people who were registered as Democrats started to go like this, and the number of people who are registered as Republicans started to go like that. The Republican one went faster, and the number of people who are registered as unenrolleds went like this. And nationally, the unenrolleds are now 50% of the electorate. And in Massachusetts, they're 60% of the electorate. And I think what's happened, and I think what's going to continue to happen because of these incredibly powerful voices on the edges of both parties, is more and more people who are not ideologues are going to continue to walk away from their respective parties, and that middle, that unenrolled population is going to continue to grow. And I think by the 28 election, not by the 24, but by the 28 election, I think maybe it's meant somewhere between 55 and 60% of the electorate are going to be unenrolled. And in Massachusetts, I think that number will probably be close to 70. And I don't think the parties understand what's going on, because if they did, they would worry a lot about the floor that's kind of disappearing underneath them. And it's happening faster to the Republicans than it is to the Democrats, but it's happening to both of them. And I think what's probably going to happen is at some point, we're going to see a whole bunch of candidates run as independents and chase that unenrolled voter block and basically say, that's who I'm running to represent. And they're going to start winning elections because they don't have to run in primaries. They can focus wholly on the general. And the way the fundraising rules work now, it's actually easier to do that than it was 20 years ago. And social media makes it way easier to build a team and deliver a message. And so if you were to say to me, like, what's going to happen? I don't think my Republican Party's coming back. But I think the Democrats are going to have the same problem that the Republicans have. It will be different, and it will take longer, but they're going to have the same problem. And what's really going to happen is you're going to see more and more people get elected who aren't in a party.
So now one of the questions that got submitted often when I kind of went through the member submissions is, does Governor Baker want to trade president titles for another president position? Is that something you'd ever consider or does the environment make it less likely that you'd ever want to be in it?
I actually think at 28 I'd be a hell of a candidate, but I'm not going to be a candidate because one of the things you learn when you spend time in public life is it beats the shit out of your family.
Yep.
And the cruelty...
Yep. And it's not gotten better.
No, it's worse. And I bleed over some of the shit that's happened in my family.
Yep.
And
I'm sorry it has. You don't deserve it. So nobody does.
No, they don't. But one way you get to the candidates and you get to the electeds is through their family.
No. So, all right, so let's shift from politics to your job now. So I want to start out...
You mean you think the job I have now
Oh, no, it's getting
doesn't
worse.
have politics
Yeah,
like
so-
all over it?
Yeah, it's getting worse now.
Yeah.
Kind of the, out of the frying pan and into the fire. So I want to start out with just, so as Marcus mentioned, I was a head coach at Harvard, and when I was a head coach, I worked for the athletic director at the time was Billy Cleary. And
What a great man.
And you know Coach Cleary well.
I sure do.
Coach Cleary wrote his book on amateurism.
He did.
And
That's right.
he can't stand the idea of kind of athletes being professional. And I got to go back to like two things I jotted down. One is, and they're both from the Ivy League Charter. And the Ivy League Charter is that athletes should be participants in a recreational form of competition rather than performers in a public spectacle. And then I found a quote from Bill Bingham.
That's a good one.
Who was the athletic director at Harvard, and he said, the Ivy League was formed for those that believe that amateur athletics want our college teams to be represented by students who are incidentally taking part in sports rather than athletes who are incidentally going to college. Does Harvard belong in the NCAA anymore?
Okay, so this is really interesting. There are 1,100 schools
You've got
in the
a broad
NCAA,
constituency now.
okay? There are 19,000 teams, there's 520,000 athletes, right? But when most people talk about college sports,
It's Deion
they
Sanders.
talk about 5% of it.
Yep.
5. They talk about 50 or 60 programs out of 1,100, okay? So they're big. They're really big. The smallest one has an athletic budget that's over $100 million bucks, all right? But honestly, they are not college athletics. They aren't. The vast majority of college athletics is much more like Harvard than it is like
Alabama football.
Alabama. There's a good one. And my challenge, as I see it, is to figure out how to create a framework for these folks, right? And a framework for these folks. But right now, they're all in the same framework, which makes no sense because this business model is completely different than these. I mean, more than half of all of those 1,100 schools have an athletic budget that's under $25 million. Under $25 million. More than half, like almost 70%. So you have this dynamic where everybody pays attention to the major programs and calls that college sports. the lessons those kids learn, okay, are very similar to the lessons everybody else who plays college sports learns. I mean, college sports is where, by the way, did you guys know that 94% of all the women who are in C-suites in America were college athletes? Should anybody be surprised by that? And women's college sports is literally going like this, and it is going to be staggeringly amazing over the course of the next decade.
What was the crowd earlier this week? Was it 56,000 that watched?
That watched Caitlin Clark and the Iowa basketball team in the football stadium in Iowa. But there were 92,000 people who showed up at the Nebraska football stadium in the heat of the Nebraska summer to watch the Nebraska volleyball team play the Omaha volleyball team. I was actually one of the people who was there. That was one of the coolest events I've ever been to in my life. It set a world record for the largest attendance at any women's sporting event ever anywhere. And I think, for me, the real thing is, what is college sports about? It teaches you how to be a good teammate, how to, basically put your interests aside for the benefit of the operation overall. It teaches you how to get up when you get knocked down. It teaches you how to lose and learn from losing. And I'll tell you something, I learned a lot from losing. But part of the reason I learned a lot from losing was because I had been taught how to learn a lot from losing. It teaches you how to be what I would describe as something greater than just yourself, and to understand what it's like to be part of that. And I don't care if you're playing for Babson or Harvard or Northwestern or Alabama. Those are some of the lessons you're going to learn. And for me, the key here is recognize and understand what this college sport model looks like and treat it accordingly, and recognize what this one looks like and treat it accordingly, instead of pretending that we can fit them all inside the box that Billy Cleary, God bless him, wants them all to be in. They're not the same, and we shouldn't pretend that they are. And for years and years, people have, and it's created gear grinding all the way across college athletics.
Help me with it. I know you were down on the Hill earlier this week talking on this topic.
Yep.
I'm surprised to see things like Dartmouth talking about unionizing athletes and things like that. Talk to me about that level of kind of the whole issue that you were talking about on the Hill on Tuesday of our athletes, employees, and that whole and I'm surprised to see that coming from a Dartmouth, not from a which I think you might have remembered that Dartmouth hoops is not the thing that we all feared. So
I feared him when I played against him. I don't know how the Dartmouth case is going to play out. It's from
but just in general, can you speak to that issue? Where's that coming from?
I'm not exactly sure. I can tell you that one of the ironies of the Dartmouth case is they have 4 guys who play on their team who are international students, and they're here on student visas. And if they did become employees, they would no longer be allowed to be here, and they would have to go home. In fact, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of international student athletes in the U.S. because there's no place else like the U.S. where somebody who's between the ages of 18 and 25 can actually go to college and practice their craft. I mean, we send an enormous amount, 75% of all the people who play on our Olympic team are NCAA students or graduates. But there's also a giant number of graduates or students from American colleges and universities who are on the Olympic teams from all over the world. If you put those 2 numbers together, it would be one of the largest teams in the Olympics. And again, it's like underneath the surface of all these conversations, there's so many things going on in college sports that are wonderful, and they don't get anywhere near the visibility they deserve. And as far as I don't know where the NLRB stuff's coming from. I thought the suit they filed in California, I'm not a lawyer, but I spent a lot of time in healthcare and government. I've read a lot of lawsuits. I thought it was a joke. I really did. We're going to win that one, period. And if you talk to our 3 biggest student athlete advisory councils have all written letters to members of Congress saying they don't want to be employees. They want to be student athletes. And I took the job in part because I think there's a way to solve this problem that will work for student athletes at every level and will work for schools. But it's going to require everybody to get out of their, out of their particular hole in the ground, okay? This is kind of a trench war that's going on right now, and be willing to have an honest conversation about what makes sense. And one of the things that happened during this hearing when Senator Blumenthal, who chaired this thing, he asked all of the panelists if college athletes should be employees, right? From one end to the other.
Yep.
And it included a bunch of people who are, of my point of view, but it also included a bunch of people who for a very long time have said student athletes should be not only employees, they should be in a union, right? So they're working their way down the line and they get to one of the loudest voices on this, and he says, only FBS football players and Division I men's and women's basketball. Those are the only ones he said should be employees. Now, to me, that was like, and I'm maybe looking for it, but that was like a breakthrough because he's starting to have a conversation for the first time about this, right?
Yep.
And I'm all in on that conversation. Let's figure that out. But I don't want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater because we can't get past the ideological prejudice that both sides are coming in. Billy coming in and saying no, and these people coming in and saying no. I mean, this is like a classic example of where there is a middle ground that will work. And all I got to do is figure out how to get everybody to go there.
Got it. So look, I'm delighted to hear that idea. As a former Ivy League college water polo player, and like yourself, took a lot away from the experience. It was one of the formative experiences of my life, and learning to become a leader, but not quite the revenue sport that some others were, as it turns out. You might not be aware of the numbers.
Basketball at Harvard, I'll tell you, back then was
you
a
might
real
not be
revenue
aware
sport.
of the numbers on Harvard water polo, but good seats are still available. So I want to ask you though about, as you say, like this side, like kind of the Power Five conferences and and that whole mess. So, and that's a place where I'm just curious as to where are the guardrails and where are some of the things you see there. So I'm watching, for example. One of my daughters went to Clemson, and I just totally bought into Clemson football in the last 4 years and loved watching it. But what's been interesting is watching how they haven't bought into the transfer portal. Dabo Swinney is really outspoken on this is craziness.
Does everybody know what the transfer portal is?
So can you speak about what the transfer portal is and just where do you see the limits on this whole I'll speak to it. That's one area. Another area I'll speak to, so I'll give you a compound question. Another one I'll talk about is in basketball. Harvard basketball has done pretty well, sending people to the State House, and Governor Healy was here a couple of months ago and said she could still take you in horse.
I am literally last in line. I'm discovering here.
She said she could still take you.
She's a lot younger.
She said she says she's going to stand in the corner and just shoot. I'm just saying. But college basketball has become also the land of NBA prep of one and done in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Where are the limits when you talk about this side being different than this side? I buy into that, but where are the limits on all of that? There's got to be some place that it falls apart.
I have this funny tendency to go back and read really old things that people write about stuff, because the longer I've lived, the more I've come to believe that
it's all cyclical.
Whatever it is, it happened before. And there's a great article in Sports Illustrated in 1938 about the horrors of college football. And Byron White, who played football at Colorado and played professionally and almost won the Heisman Trophy. He lost to Clint Frank from Yale. That's how long ago he was playing football. He ended up on the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1984, he wrote the dissent in the sort of penultimate case of the NCAA versus the College Football Association over TV rights for football. And the court ruled that it was an antitrust violation for the NCAA to control college football. And Byron wrote, as the only person who actually knew anything about college football, he wrote that the reason he was writing a dissent was because he believed the way the NCAA treated the revenue from college football, which was the NCAA brought it in and then distributed it equally to everybody. And a lot of it was, and then it was half and half into academic and athletic activity, which he said was a legitimate public purpose and why he thought the antitrust exemption should have been granted. And he said, and I fear now that what will happen is there will be a mad race to TV contracts and TV rights, and we will end up with a system in which we have haves and have-nots, and where academics will no longer matter, and the thing that will drive every decision that universities make will be football and TV contracts. And, it took a while to get there, but the guy was exactly right. And the reason I say that is, for the most part, this about academics, athletics, football, everything else, it's been going on for a really long time. The only reason there is an NCAA is because Teddy Roosevelt called all the college presidents into the White House in like 1906 or something and said, either you guys create an organization that creates rules around safety when it comes to football, or I'm going to abolish it. And so this is just, we have a love-hate relationship with this game.
Yep.
And I think you can do things to make it work if you're willing to acknowledge differences and the challenges that come with very big revenue sports and not so big revenue sports, all working kind of in the same family.
So what are the limits that you'd put on those very big revenue sports? Would you put limits on things, that would just, is there a point where they're becoming too much like pro programs?
Well, I'll tell you what one of the biggest limits of all is right now, and you could solve this one, right? If you created the right model, which is Title IX. All right? Under Title IX, men and women are supposed to get the same thing, right? It's a great thing. It's made a huge difference in women's athletics generally, and in youth sports for women as well. But right now, all the NIL money, so-called, which is coming from collectives, which are these organizations that are loosely affiliated. They're basically where boosters went, okay? And 90% plus, some of them it's 99% of their money goes to men's basketball players and football players. But they are kind of almost really part of their institutions, right? So part of the answer there is figuring out some way, which is admittedly a political challenge, but a debate and discussion we're having. If you're going to have NIL programs that are that closely linked to the schools, they should have to comply with Title IX. The minute you do that, you change the entire dynamic about where NIL money goes. Because now, if you want to spend any amount of money on a football player, you got to spend the same amount on a volleyball player. If you want to spend that money on a men's basketball player, you got to spend it on a women's basketball player. And now all of a sudden, the program that makes all the money, which is football, is suddenly going to be even with respect to how they treat students and student athletes with all the programs that don't make money. And that's exactly the way you get out of from under some of the challenge there. Now, the transfer portal, for those of you who probably never want to know what it is something the NCAA put in place a few years ago to make it possible for athletes, student athletes, in the 5 sports where you couldn't transfer and play immediately to be able to. Now, most people don't even know there were 5 sports where you couldn't transfer and play immediately. The 5 sports were men's basketball, men's football, ice hockey, men's ice hockey, I think golf, and one other. And I'm not remembering, lacrosse, I think. And the bottom line was, it was just sort of an anomaly of history. that it worked that way. But one of the challenges for the NCAA coming out of some of the court decisions at the federal level was you need to treat everybody the same. So they said, okay, we'll make it possible for student athletes to transfer right away and play right away for those sports. And by doing that, at the same time that this NIL thing and the collectives all got started, created this incredible pull coming from the collectives to try to basically steal kids from one school and get them to go to another one. And of the 166,000 athletes, and this is really not a D2 or a D3 issue, this is really a D1 issue.
Yep.
Of the 166,000 athletes in D1, 20,000 of them in 22 transferred through the portal. Now, a couple things to remember here. The first is, which everybody forgets, the first is the class of 23 and the class of 24, kids graduating this spring, kids graduating next spring, they never really got a good look at the college they were going to before they went. Because the kids who were graduating with the class of 24, right, this year, those kids were looking at schools in the spring of 20. So they never visited a campus. So the fact that a whole bunch of kids transferred, student athletes actually transfer less than the population overall. But every time one of them transfers, some coach gets annoyed. Now that same coach gets very happy when somebody transfers to his school or her school. But so the classes of 24 and 25, both of them, those kids never really got a look at their school coming in the door. And so the fact that a lot of them transferred, both student athletes and non-student athletes, should be a surprise to no one. All right? The dust will settle, in my opinion, a little bit when you get to the class of 26 because they were the first class to actually be allowed to go back and take a look. The other thing you have to remember here, and this is just, again, kind of a fact of life, students these days are not like students when I was a student. When I was a student, the idea that you would transfer was like a completely foreign concept. And it, you know, whether you went to Harvard or any place, you just didn't do it, in part because you didn't have access to anywhere near the same kind of information about what's possible. And you certainly didn't have the ability to stay in touch with all your friends like this and have some friend, you know, sending you pictures and telling you stories about how great life was at their campus. I mean, I used to write letters to my friends, right? I'd write a letter, I'd mail it, they'd get it like 3 or 4 days later, they'd write me a letter, I'd get it 3 or 4 days later. I had big stacks of them like this from all the guys and gals I was staying in touch with. And I don't ever remember anybody ever sending anybody a picture from about anything
It
from
didn't
anywhere.
exist,
And
Thank you, that's why you got elected governor.
no, but
So,
good point. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Really good point. The point I'm trying to make here is these kids have completely different expectations about the idea of staying someplace for 4 years. They just do. And then you toss COVID into the middle of it, and then you toss the possibility that a new coach shows up, and all of a sudden I'm not playing anymore, and I could go somewhere else. I got a 3.3 grade point average. There's plenty of other schools that would be interested in me, and it's just going to be part of the way the show goes. And I get the fact that the traditionalists don't like it, and I've talked to a lot of coaches, really good ones, people whose names you would know, who love to transform their student athletes, who believe that they have a developmental responsibility, who are like, this is screwing up my ability to bring to the table my greatest strength, which is to take a young person and help them grow up. And I get it, but that's not the world. You got to be willing to live with the world we're in when it comes to some of this stuff.
All right. Bad news for Clemson, Lauren.
I just think it just means Clemson's got to be willing to adapt.
To adapt, move forward, like the Patriots, but that's a whole nother fireside chat. So I want to talk for a minute, just also about where the Harvard clubs talk about your time at Harvard. So in my vast research for this, at 6:15, I looked at your Wikipedia page, your Wikipedia page said that your time at Harvard, and this is a quote on your Wikipedia page, said that was 4 years that you'd kind of just rather forget. Now, granted, this Wikipedia had also said that you and Tom Brady combined for 7 Super Bowl rings. It had all kinds of other things on there too.
I was really lucky I got that stuff in there.
But I was curious about that quote. Is it true, and why?
So in my 5th year Red Book submission, I said that.
Yep.
I said, and I, I had a very mixed experience. I mean, when I talk about the fact that it would have never occurred to me to transfer, it wouldn't have. But okay, I'll give you some examples. I never got to know a single professor when I was at Harvard. I heard some titters back there, which may be because I wasn't a good enough student, but I don't think that was it. The vast majority of the classroom activity in the classes that I took were run by RAs and TAs.
Yep.
And some of those people I'm still in touch with. I love them. They were incredible. Mm-hmm. But I thought Harvard was a pretty hard place to find your space.
Well, you were in Mather House, so that's tough.
I was in Mather House. And for me, honestly, the space I found that I was happiest in was the basketball team. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the reason why the basketball team experience was so fundamental to my time there. My brother went to Harvard. He's 4 years younger than me, and he had a great time. And sometimes things fit and sometimes they don't.
So what would you tell an incoming freshman now?
Well, hell, it was, 1,000 years ago.
I know that,
when I graduated.
but for advice, you've done some stuff since then. Like, what advice would you give an incoming freshman?
You absolutely have to find your peeps somehow. You have to, or the place will eat you alive. It just will.
Now,
because there's a whole ton of really smart people here who are perfectly happy to point out how stupid you are if you let them.
So also on that note, as we start getting to the top of the hour, I have a couple of kind of lightning round questions for you. So I know you were in Mather House. What was your freshman dorm?
Thayer Middle.
Okay.
So I woke up almost every morning to the chimes of the church. It was right out my window.
That's a nice early morning wake-up call.
Sure is, yep.
What are your roommates up to? And are you have you done kind of reasonably well amongst your roommates? Or I always think of poor Tommy Lee Jones, who's got to sit there with his Oscar saying, friggin' Al Gore, taking all the props in my rooming group.
Speaking of Tommy Lee Jones, you guys should watch The Burial. It's really, really good.
All right, we'll check it out. All
okay.
Right. So let's talk about your roommates. How do your roommates do? Any other governors?
No governors.
Okay.
Although I did have a classmate who's a governor.
All right.
Phil Murphy, the governor of New Jersey.
He's pretty good.
A classmate of mine. You mean you haven't had him here yet?
Not yet. Yeah. We'll get him. Yeah, we'll get him. Yeah. I like that.
This is a little bit of a downer. 2 of my roommates have passed away. They both had cancer, which was just hugely sad for all of us. And the other 2 are, guys who did well in business and are living kind of happy. They're retired and kind of living happily ever after.
Okay.
And I lived in one of those suites in Mather where you had like 46 roommates.
Yep.
3 of my roommates, who were not out when I was in college, are gay. And I always wish that they'd been able
It's a different time.
to be themselves. And my brother's gay, and I was really glad that, only 4 years behind me, he was able to kind of mostly be who he was.
Did you have a favorite class?
Yes.
What was it?
This is going to be...
Frank Phillips warned me about how you'd answer questions, by the way.
This is going to be kind of a funny one. My favorite class was actually English 10, which was a really random walk through English literature. But what made it my favorite class was the TA who ran it, who was a woman named Betsy Blackmar, who's a professor at Columbia now. And I actually reached out to her about a month or two ago, and just typed her a note and said, God, I always think about you because you were like one of the real shining lights of my time at Harvard. And I think, one of the things I've discovered about myself over the years is I am much more, I'm an ideas guy, there's no question about that, but I connect to people. That's probably why I was interested in public life in the first place. And most of the classes I really liked, there was somebody who I just really connected with on it. There was also a guy, I took a course in American history that was taught by a professor named Frank, and I'm not going to remember his last name. Anybody help me here? How do you spell his last name? Yes. That guy was hilarious. That was, yeah. I loved his lectures. I loved his course. The TA in that one was kind of a dork, but
Happens.
But Frank was the best. I loved him. Thought he was great.
And what were the Charlie Baker hangout spots of your time at Harvard?
The Oxford Ale House, which doesn't exist anymore.
There's a lot of good places. Now, we'll get to another follow-up question on that, but go on.
Jonathan Swift's, which also doesn't exist anymore. I spent a little time at Jack's, but not much. I loved that place. I'm not going to remember the name of it. It was near Jack's. It was on the way to Jack's on
Mass Ave?
Mass Ave.
Yeah.
The Plow.
Oh, the Plow and Stars.
Plow and
yeah,
Stars.
that's still there.
That's great. Is it really?
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Those are
So if
top four.
being governor of Massachusetts had given you the power to bring back anything from Harvard Square that has gone out in the last, in the last years, what would you bring back?
The movie theater.
Ah, nice. Yeah.
I got two really funny stories about this.
All right.
One is, I saw Bruce Springsteen play there.
You saw the 1975 show?
He was the warm-up act
For Bonnie
Raitt.
Yeah. That was what the future of rock and roll was
I didn't think Bonnie Raitt was going to come out.
Bruce Springsteen. Yeah, that was it.
And the second one, I was a big Clash fan, and the Clash played at that Harvard Square Theater, and I'm late. I'm racing in to get to it. They had like 6 sets of doors you had to get to get into the theater, and I'm busting my way through the doors, and then all of a sudden this guy is running out like this, and he throws up all over me. And
that was when you met Governor Weld?
And so I'm like, and I'm peeling it off me, and I go into the bathroom, and we all know the bathroom in that place is a friggin' joke. The water, you turn the water on, and drip, drip, drip. And I was in there forever trying to clean myself off, and then I was like, can I really actually go sit in my seat like this? And I concluded I couldn't, and so I walked up to one of the ushers, and I said, I had an accident, it wasn't my fault. Can I just stand up here and watch the concert? Because I was tall enough to see over the thing there. And he kind of gave me the look, and he's like, yeah, you can stand there. So I watched the show standing up in the back and stinking of somebody else's bad behavior.
Well, Governor, if you saw the Clash, you might have seen Should I Stay or Should I Go? And I will say, while we would love to have you stay, I know that you'd said that you had a hard stop at 8 o'clock, and that at some point
I'm going to try to get to watch the president's comments on Israel.
And Governor, I thought your thoughts on that on Twitter the other day were very thoughtful and appreciated by the community, and appreciate that that's one of those things I'll say as the president of the NCAA, you don't have to weigh in, but it's appreciated when you do, and your thoughtfulness is appreciated, and as is your being here tonight. So thank you so much for spending part of your night with us.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Governor Baker.
Thanks, Calvin. That was fun. Did you enjoy that? Thank you.